Get out of my penthouse." The words didn't just ring through the grand hallway. They sliced through the heavy, pristine silence of the duplex like a jagged piece of glass. The little girl didn't cry. She didn't run. She didn't even flinch the way most 4-year-olds would when an adult screams with such raw, venomous hatred. Instead, she just stood there on the flawless, diamond-polished quartz floor, her tiny feet tucked into a pair of cheap, worn-out, light-up boots that looked completely out of place in a $45 million apartment. She was the very definition of pure, unblemished innocence holding her breath, her small cheeks flushed, totally incapable of understanding why the beautiful lady in the silk robe looked at her as if she were dirt. She just looked up with those enormous, hauntingly familiar ash-gray eyes, tilting her head slightly, and clutched the faded frayed edge of her mother's denim apron. Her mother, Elena, froze in absolute paralyzing terror. Her knuckles turned white as she stood rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the polished floorboards, her breathing completely stopped. Every single person in that grand entryway, from the head butler, standing stiffly by the double oak doors, to the junior maids, clutching their dusters, went completely, utterly silent. The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. Victoria stood over them, her sharp features twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust, her eyes flashing with a cold, unforgiving glare that could make a grown man tremble. You could hear the faint, muffled hum of the Manhattan traffic 60 stories below, but inside the penthouse, time had stopped. And then footsteps. Slow, heavy, calculated. The unmistakable sound of bespoke leather dress shoes striking the floating glass staircase that connected the 2 floors of the Sky Mansion. The Titan of Wall Street was coming downstairs. Julian Vance had heard everything. Every single word, and what happened in the next 60 seconds would forever alter the trajectory of every life bound to that house. Hey, welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you are new here, I am so incredibly glad you stumbled upon this video today. Do me a huge favor right now, drop a comment below and tell me which state or country you are watching from. You know I love seeing our community light up the map from New York to Texas, all the way to California. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please do it right now. Why? Because on this channel, we tell stories that don't just pass the time, they genuinely make you feel something real. Stay with me until the very, very end of today's story. I promise you the final twist is something I did not see coming myself, and it will completely rewrite how you feel about everything you are about to watch. All right, let's begin. Some homes look like an absolute paradise from the outside, but the people who cross their thresholds every day know the heavy truth. The Vance penthouse sat like a crown jewel at the very top of a glass and steel skyscraper overlooking Central Park. From the bustling streets of Manhattan, it looked like a mirage, a symbol of ultimate American success. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls that caught the fading evening light, scattering it like liquid gold across minimalist white marble and custom-designed art installations. Inside, it always smelled of expensive wood smoke, white tea candles, and old money. But tucked away in the back of that massive Sky Mansion in a small, windowless laundry room that no important guest ever visited, a 29-year-old woman named Elena Cruz hummed quietly to herself while she precisely folded Egyptian cotton sheets. Elena was 29, an immigrant's daughter with dark hair pulled back into a neat, sensible bun. Her hands were always busy, her knuckles slightly calloused, and her eyes always carried a faint hint of exhaustion. She had worked as the exclusive housekeeper for Julian Vance for 5 long years. 5 years of waking up at 4 in the morning to catch the crowded subway from Queens into Manhattan. 5 years of polishing quartz countertops and dusting rare sculptures that other people looked at without ever seeing the labor behind them. 5 years of being completely invisible in a house full of wealth. Elena never complained. Not once, because every heavy basket of laundry she carried, every floor she scrubbed on her knees, she did for one singular heartbeat of a reason: her daughter Mia. Mia was 4 years old, tiny, extraordinarily sweet, and possessing a gentle laugh that somehow made the cold, hyper-modern kitchen feel like a real home. She was a child of simple joys, blissfully unaware of the concept of wealth or social status. Give her a plastic spoon or a colorful piece of string, and her face would light up with a radiant, gap-toothed smile that could melt the coldest winter frost. Because Elena had no family in the city and couldn't afford the exorbitant cost of Manhattan childcare, Mia spent her days tucked quietly in the corner of whatever room Elena was working in. She would sit on a small folded fleece blanket, playing with a well-loved, slightly tattered teddy bear she had named Barnaby, whispering sweet, imaginary stories to him and watching her mother work with wide, wondering eyes full of unconditional adoration. Elena had been terrified when she first started, but Mr. Vance, the brilliant, fiercely guarded venture capitalist who owned the penthouse, had always been quietly understanding about the situation. He was a man known on Wall Street for his ruthless efficiency and cold demeanor, but when it came to Mia, he was different. He never complained about seeing the child in the hallways. In fact, sometimes when he passed through the kitchen to grab an espresso, he would pause. He would glance down at Mia with something soft and uncharacteristic in his expression, something that looked almost like a painful flash of recognition. Elena had noticed that look, but in a world like this, you don't ask questions. You don't rock the boat when you need the job to survive. You just stay quiet, stay invisible, and do your work. And for 5 years, everything had been fine. It was a manageable, careful, quiet routine. Until 6 months ago, until Victoria arrived. Victoria Sterling did not merely walk into the Vance penthouse. She claimed it. She was 32 years old, the heiress to a historic New York real estate empire, and she possessed the kind of striking, high-fashion beauty that demanded absolute submission from every room she entered. With her impeccably styled ash-blonde bob, razor-sharp cheekbones, and ice-water green eyes, she moved through life with the unshakable confidence of a woman who believed the world was her private country club. Her smile was a weapon hollow calculated and sharp enough to cut glass. Within 2 months of dating Julian, she had packed up her Upper East Side apartment and moved her massive wardrobe into his master suite. By the 4th month, a flawless, custom-cut 3-carat emerald diamond sat heavily on her left ring finger. And almost immediately, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from quiet minimalism to suffocating tension. The staff, a tight-knit team of 5 who had served Julian for years with fierce loyalty, quickly learned that Victoria had aggressive opinions on absolutely everything. She detested the way the imported white tea candles were arranged. She threw tantrums if the pH balance of her mineral water wasn't perfect. She demanded that Julian's bespoke Italian silk shirts be steamed 3 separate times to eliminate microscopic creases that only she could see. But her cruelest, most obsessive fixation was reserved entirely for Mia. "Julian, darling, why on earth is there a servant's child roaming freely through a $45 million estate?" Victoria had asked one evening. She was lounging on the white velvet sofa, her eyes glued to her iPhone as she scrolled through a luxury lifestyle feed, her voice dripping with an effortless, casual malice. Elena had been standing less than 10 feet away, meticulously polishing the adjacent glass partitions, hearing every single biting syllable. Her chest tightened and her breath caught in her throat. "The child is exceptionally quiet, Miss Sterling," the head butler. Mr. Abernathy had interjected carefully, stepping forward with his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. He had a kind, fatherly soul and had often slipped extra strawberries into Mia's little snack bowls. She never causes a bit of trouble, and she stays strictly in the back quarters while her mother works. Victoria hadn't even bothered to look up from her screen. A cold, dismissive sneer curled the corner of her perfectly painted lips. "That is entirely beside the point, Abernathy. This is a high-end architectural masterpiece, a private sanctuary for one of the most powerful investors on Wall Street. It is not a subsidized daycare for the working class. It looks incredibly tacky." Elena had immediately lowered her eyes, staring hard at the microfiber cloth in her trembling hands, saying absolutely nothing. Over the course of her life, she had become an expert at saying nothing. Have you ever had to swallow your pride, grip your hands into fists, and stay completely silent about an insult that cut you to the absolute core simply because you knew that reacting would destroy the only thing you loved more than life itself? If you have ever felt that suffocating weight in your chest, then you already understand Elena better than any words I could ever write for you. She knew her place. She knew that in the ruthless hierarchy of Manhattan's elite, an immigrant housekeeper's voice carried no weight. So she swallowed the glass, buried her pain deep inside, and prayed that her invisibility would keep her daughter safe. But there are some storms that no amount of silence can protect you from. Because on that morning, a bitter, freezing Tuesday in late November, with a brutal New York blizzard howling against the panoramic windows, Victoria came downstairs much earlier than her usual 10 o'clock wake-up call. And innocent little Mia was in the exact wrong place at the exact wrong time. What happened next in that grand sunlit entryway lasted for less than 2 minutes, but the devastating echoes of those 120 seconds would reshape the destiny of everyone under that roof for the rest of their lives. It started with a moment of pure childlike wonder. Mia had woken up early that morning, her eyes bright and sleep-muddied. While Elena was busy heavy-lifting the laundry crates into the industrial washers in the deep back rooms, Mia had quietly padded out of the kitchen in her little socks, the soft pink ones with the tiny rubber duckies on the soles to keep her from slipping on the slick stone. She was carrying Barnaby, her tattered teddy bear under one arm, her imagination running wild as she explored the quiet, sleeping penthouse. To a 4-year-old, the vast, empty hallway was a majestic kingdom waiting to be discovered. As she reached the base of the floating glass staircase, her foot brushed against something hidden in the plush, custom-woven wool runner. She stopped and knelt down, her little light-up bulltoes flashing a faint, colorful red and blue. Her tiny, chubby fingers reached out and pried the object from the thick fibers of the rug. It was a heavy, circular object, crafted from pure white gold and encrusted with a cluster of rare midnight black diamonds that caught the morning light like a dark constellation. It was one of Julian's signature custom-commissioned cufflinks, something he must have accidentally dropped while rushing home from a late-night board meeting the evening prior. To anyone else, it was an irreplaceable piece of jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars. But to a sweet, untainted 4-year-old girl, it was simply a piece of fallen magic. It was a shiny, beautiful star that had fallen from the sky just for her. Mia held it tightly in her palm, her face lighting up with that breathtaking gap-toothed smile of pure, unadulterated joy, the kind of genuine happiness that only a very small child can experience over something the rest of the cynical world would appraise with greed. Excited by her discovery, she stood up straight, turned around to run back to the kitchen to show her mother her new treasure, and walked directly into the path of a descending storm. Victoria was walking down the glass stairs. She was dressed in a sweeping ivory silk robe that trailed behind her like vapor, a porcelain cup of oat milk latte in one hand, and her iPad in the other, her brow furrowed over an email. She froze 2 steps from the bottom of the staircase. Her cold green eyes snapped down. She looked at Mia. Mia, completely innocent and knowing no malice, looked back up at her. For a few agonizing seconds, the grand hallway was dead silent. And then Mia did exactly what any trusting sweet child would do when they find something beautiful and want to share the magic with the world. She extended both of her tiny hands upward, offering the glittering black diamond cufflink to the icy woman standing above her, her face completely open, loving, and trusting. "Pretty," Mia whispered softly, her little voice echoing off the high quartz walls. "Look, lady, pretty." But as Victoria's eyes locked onto the high-end jewelry in the child's small, sticky hands, a look of profound, venomous fury flushed across her pale face. The fragile piece of the penthouse was about to violently shatter. The innocence radiating from Mia's face did not soften the icy glare of the woman standing above her. If anything, the child's pure, trusting gesture only seemed to stoke the embers of an inexplicable rage deep within Victoria's chest. Victoria's green eyes narrowed into slits as they locked onto the custom-made white gold and black diamond cufflink resting in Mia's tiny palms. To Victoria, this wasn't a sweet moment of a child sharing a discovery. This was an act of boundary crossing, a violation of the immaculate world she was trying to build. A harsh, ugly sneer completely distorted her beautiful features. "Where did you get that?" Victoria demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet morning air like a whip. She didn't reach down to take the jewelry. Instead, she stepped down the remaining 2 stairs, her towering presence casting a long, dark shadow over the little girl. Mia's radiant smile faltered just a fraction. She lowered her hand slightly, her small fingers curling instinctively around the glittering object to protect it, though she still didn't understand the danger she was in. She looked up, her large ash-gray eyes blinking with a sudden confused sadness. "In the carpet," Mia whispered, her voice losing its cheerful lilt. It was cold." "Where is your mother?" Victoria barked, completely ignoring the child's explanation. Her tone was climbing, shedding its usual aristocratic composure and exposing a raw, jarring hostility. "Elena, get out here right now." Mia's bottom lip began to tremble violently. She took a tiny, hesitant step backward, clutching her tattered teddy bear Barnaby so tightly against her chest that the seams groaned. The flashing red and blue lights on her little bulltoes blinked once, twice, then faded, as if matching the sudden drop in the room's warmth. She had never been spoken to like this in her entire life. In her innocent world, adults were kind. They smiled when she showed them pretty things. They didn't look at her like she was a thief. That was the exact moment Elena came rushing around the corner from the deep back corridor. She had heard the piercing shout all the way from the laundry room. Her heart had instantly leaped into her throat. She ran into the grand hallway, her face pale, a crisp white Egyptian cotton pillowcase still gripped in her trembling hands. "Miss Sterling, oh my God, I am so sorry," Elena gasped, dropping to her knees beside Mia, her voice shaking with an agonizing blend of panic and humility. She immediately pulled Mia into her side, her eyes darting between Victoria's furious expression and the object in her daughter's hand. "I am so sorry. I only turned my back for a single second to load the industrial washer. She was right next to me, I swear. This is exactly what I have been warning Julian about." Victoria's voice had dropped from a shout into a terrifyingly cold, controlled hiss. She stood tall, her arms crossed tightly over her ivory silk robe, looking down at the kneeling mother and child, as if they were a stain on her pristine white marble. "This child has absolutely no business being in the main living areas of this penthouse. She is unsupervised, she is invasive, and now she is going through Mr. Vance's personal belongings." "No, Miss Sterling, please, she didn't mean any harm." Elena pleaded, her throat tight with unshed tears. She gently pried the heavy black diamond cufflink from Mia's fingers and held it out toward Victoria, her hand shaking uncontrollably. "She's only 4. She thought it was a toy. She doesn't understand what it is. I will take her straight back to the quarters right now. You won't see her for the rest of the day, I promise you." "No, I am completely done having this conversation over and over again," Victoria said. With a sharp, theatrical click, she set her porcelain latte cup down on the minimalist quartz console table. The liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the white surface, but Victoria didn't care. She turned her entire body to face them, her posture rigid, her eyes moving from Elena's tear-stained face down to Mia's frightened, wide eyes and back again. There was no mercy in her gaze. It was the look of a ruthless landlord evicting an unwanted tenant, a high society gatekeeper purging an outsider from her kingdom. "This is my home now," Victoria continued, her voice cracking through the vast hallway like the sound of ice breaking on a winter lake. "And I did not sign up to share my luxury sanctuary with a careless maid and her street urchin child. I want you both gone." Elena felt the room spin. The air left her lungs completely. "Miss Sterling, please. I've worked for Mr. Vance for 5 years. He knows Mia is here. Julian is a busy man who tolerates far too much out of pity." Victoria snapped, her voice rising again, fueled by a deep, burning malice. "But I don't operate on pity. Look at this place. You are turning a multi-million-dollar masterpiece into a low-class tenement. I am the future mistress of this estate, and I say your time is up." Mia, sensing the overwhelming terror radiating from her mother, let out a tiny, stifled whimper. She buried her face into the crook of Elena's neck, her small shoulders shaking. She didn't understand the words sanctuary or tenement, but she understood the weaponized hatred in the air. Elena's heart broke into 1,000 pieces right there on the cold floor. She looked at Victoria, seeing nothing but a wall of unyielding, wealthy arrogance. There was no appealing to this woman's humanity, because to Victoria, Elena and Mia weren't even human, they were merely inconveniences. Can you even begin to fathom the sheer suffocating dread that washed over Elena in that moment? To have spent 5 years building a fragile, safe haven for your fatherless child in the heart of a brutal city, only to watch a woman in a silk robe destroy it all in less than 2 minutes because of a dropped piece of jewelry. Victoria leaned in slightly, delivering the final, crushing blow with absolute relish. "Pack your bags, Elena, both of you. I want you out of this penthouse by tonight." The word tonight did not just land, it crashed into the grand hallway like a physical weight, shattering whatever fragile hope Elena had left. Outside, the fierce New York blizzard rattled the massive glass panes, throwing sheets of white powder against the skyscraper. The city below was grinding to a halt, swallowed by freezing temperatures and dangerous roads. And inside, Elena was being told to throw her 4-year-old daughter into the middle of it. "Tonight!" Elena's voice was barely a whisper, a ragged gasp of air from a throat choked with panic. She wrapped both of her arms around Mia, pulling the little girl's small body so tightly against her chest that they became one single trembling silhouette on the floor. "Miss Sterling, please. Look outside. There's a travel advisory. The subways are delayed. The weather is freezing. I don't have anywhere to take her on such short notice. Please let me stay until the weekend, just until I can find a room." "I don't care about the weather, and I certainly don't care about your logistics," Victoria replied, her voice remaining an unyielding block of ice. She didn't even glance toward the window where the storm raged. "You should have thought about the consequences before you let your child roam around like an animal. You have until 8 o'clock tonight. If you are still here when the car arrives to take Julian and me to dinner, I will have the building security drag you and your bags onto the sidewalk." Mia flinched violently at the word drag. In her terror, her tiny fingers accidentally loosened their grip on the white gold cufflink Elena had handed back to her. The heavy piece of jewelry slipped from her hand, clattering loudly against the quartz floor, bouncing twice before rolling into the dead silence between them. It came to a stop right at the edge of Victoria's pristine satin slippers. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mia didn't cry. The absolute extremity of the fear had caused her to go completely, utterly still. It was the survival mechanism of a small animal sensing a predator, the instinct to become invisible when there is no escape. She buried her face so deeply into the crook of Elena's neck that only the frayed ears of her teddy bear Barnaby were visible. Victoria looked down at the cufflink near her foot, then looked back up at Elena, a satisfied, vindictive expression settling over her face. She had won. She had asserted her dominance over the penthouse, proving that her word was law even before she officially signed the marriage certificate. Can you imagine the suffocating wave of despair that was crashing through Elena's soul in that exact moment? 5 years of spotless service, 5 years of scrubbing, dusting, and working herself to the bone to build a stable life for her daughter in the most expensive city in the world. And now everything was crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes, all because a wealthy woman felt inconvenienced by a child's innocent curiosity. What would you have done? Would you have begged? Would you have screamed? Elena had no fight left in her. She felt completely hollow, broken open by the sheer casual cruelty of the elite world she had tried so hard to serve. But nobody in that hallway was prepared for what was waiting at the top of the stairs, least of all Victoria. From somewhere high above them, a door opened, and then came the footsteps. Not the hurried, panicked steps of a servant, but the slow, measured, and dangerously calm stride of a man who ruled his empire with absolute authority. The heavy, rhythmic sound of Julian Vance's bespoke leather shoes began to echo down the floating glass staircase. Julian Vance was 36 years old. In the cutthroat boardrooms of Streetwall, he was a legend often described in financial magazines as driven, brilliant, cold, and entirely unreachable. He was the kind of man who had built a $3.5 billion venture capital firm before most people his age had even figured out their careers. He wasn't the kind of man who smiled in photos or engaged in small talk. He lived his life in the upper echelons of society, surrounded by numbers, contracts, and high-stakes valuations. But Julian possessed one rare, devastating quality that the journalists who wrote articles about his wealth never noticed. He paid absolute, meticulous attention to everything. He noticed the small things, the quiet things, the things that happened in the dark corners of rooms while everyone else was staring at the bright center. And for 5 years he had noticed Elena, not in a malicious or predatory way, but with a deep, silent respect. He had noticed the quiet dignity with which she worked. He noticed that she never asked for a handout, never complained about the long hours, and never made herself a problem for anyone. And more than anything, he had noticed Mia. He had noticed those enormous, haunting, ash-gray eyes that always seemed to watch him from the corner of the kitchen. He had noticed the way she played so carefully on her little fleece blanket, never touching the expensive art or scratching the rare wood. And he had noticed the way she would occasionally look up when he walked past, giving him a tiny, uncertain, gap-toothed smile, as if she wasn't entirely sure if a little girl like her was allowed to smile at a powerful man like him, but couldn't quite help herself. And every single time, without anyone else ever seeing, Julian had smiled back. He had never told a soul about that. Now he descended the glass staircase without rushing his tailored suit, immaculate, his expression completely unreadable. The aura of power he radiated was so intense that even the raging blizzard outside seemed to pale in comparison. Victoria turned her head sharply when she heard the footsteps. Instantly, the sharp, venomous angles of her anger began to melt away, shifting into a practiced, elegant pout. Her voice dropped its harsh edge, replacing it with the sweet, manipulative tone she always used to get her way with him. "Julian, sweetie," Victoria said, stepping toward the stairs, her hands reaching out as if looking for comfort. "Thank goodness you're awake. I was just dealing with a massive issue down here. You won't believe what I heard," Julian said. 2 words. That was all he said. But the pitch-black, frozen finality in his voice made everyone in that grand entryway go completely terrifyingly still. The air in the penthouse froze instantly. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't take her hand. He reached the bottom of the stairs, stepped onto the quartz floor, and walked right past his fiancée as if she were made of glass. Julian Vance did not look back at Victoria. The coldness radiating from his posture was a physical force cutting through the suffocating tension of the entryway. He walked past his fiancée, his eyes locked entirely on the 2 fragile figures trembling on the floor. Then one of the most powerful, ruthless men on Street Wall did something that left the entire household staff gasping in disbelief. Julian crouched down. He dropped to his knees right there on the hard, diamond-polished quartz floor of his own grand penthouse, placing his $3,000 tailored suit directly onto the ground. He lowered his massive frame until he was sitting on one heel, bringing himself completely down to the level of a frightened 4-year-old girl. Mia peeked out cautiously from the crook of Elena's neck. Her tiny, tear-streaked face was flushed with terror, her small chest hiccuping from the silent cries she had been forcing down. "Hey," Julian said. His voice was shockingly gentle, a soft, low rumble that Elena had never heard him use in all her 5 years of working for him. There wasn't a single trace of the Wall Street shark in his tone. "You dropped something." With slow, deliberate movements, Julian reached out his large, calloused hand. His long fingers brushed against the floor as he picked up the heavy white, gold, and black diamond cufflink that had rolled into the corner. He turned it over in his palm, letting the morning light reflect off the dark gems, and then extended his hand toward Mia, leaving his palm completely open and non-threatening. Mia stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Her ash-gray eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, darted from the glittering cufflink to Julian's face. She looked at his sharp jawline, his dark hair, and the intense but strangely comforting warmth hidden deep within his eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, Mia untucked her small arm from around her teddy bear Barnaby. She reached out with a trembling hand, her tiny, chubby fingers brushing against Julian's palm as she took the heavy piece of jewelry back into her possession. She cradled it against her chest like a rescued bird. "Pretty," she whispered, her voice cracking with a tiny, fragile sob. It was cold on the floor. Julian's face softened in a way that would have terrified his business competitors. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow of pain crossed his features. "Yeah," he murmured softly, his eyes locking onto hers. "It is pretty, and you can keep it." Elena's breath hitched in her throat. "Mr. Vance, please, it's too expensive. She can't—" "Elena, breathe," Julian commanded, quietly cutting her off without a hint of anger. He finally looked up at the young mother, his eyes taking in her pale face, her red-rimmed eyes, and the desperate protective way she was shielding her child. "Get up off the floor, both of you!" Julian stood up slowly, rising to his full, imposing height. The moment he straightened his shoulders, the gentle warmth vanished from his aura, replaced instantly by the towering, unyielding authority that had made him a billionaire. He turned his body completely to face Victoria. The silence that settled over the grand entryway was no longer just quiet. It had weight. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifyingly real. Nobody dared to breathe. The junior maids stood frozen like statues, and even the seasoned head butler, Mr. Abernathy, held his breath, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Victoria stood a few feet away, her arms still crossed over her ivory silk robe. Her face had gone pale when Julian bypassed her, but she was trying desperately to maintain her high society composure. She forced a hollow, patronizing laugh, stepping forward to bridge the distance between them. "Julian, darling, really," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she gestured toward Elena. "You are completely enabling this behavior. I know you have a soft spot for the help, but this is entirely inappropriate. That child was going through your private dresser upstairs, and Elena has been completely negligent. I was simply doing what needs to be done to maintain the standards of this penthouse. I told them to pack up." Julian didn't blink. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze fixed on Victoria with the terrifying detachment of a judge delivering a final verdict. "Elena and Mia are not going anywhere," Julian said. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't yell or slam his hand down on the console table. But the words were delivered with a terrifying, immovable finality, like a solid concrete foundation poured beneath all that luxury marble. Victoria's green eyes widened in utter shock. Her aristocratic mask began to slip, exposing the ugly, petulant anger underneath. "What, Julian, did you not hear me? The girl was stealing your jewelry. They are transforming our home into a circus. They are not going anywhere." Julian repeated, his voice dropping an octave lower, vibrating with a dangerous icy edge. "Tonight, or any night." Victoria stared at him, her jaw tightening so hard that the muscles in her neck strained. The humiliation of being contradicted in front of the domestic staff was burning through her veins. She took a sharp, aggressive step forward, pointing a manicured nail toward Elena. "So that's it," Victoria hissed, her voice cracking with venom. "You are honestly choosing a migrant maid and her bastard child over your own fiancée, over the woman you are supposed to marry in 4 months." Something moved across Julian's face. Then something ancient, complicated, and deeply buried like a heavy steel door, finally swinging open onto a dark room that nobody had been allowed to enter for a very long time. He looked at Victoria's enraged elite features, and then he looked back at Elena, who was standing quietly against the wall, holding a silent, wide-eyed Mia in her arms. "I need you to go upstairs, Victoria," Julian said quietly, his tone empty of any affection. "Pack a bag for the weekend. I need to speak with Elena, alone." Victoria stood entirely paralyzed at the base of the staircase, her breath hitching as Julian's words settled over her like a layer of thick frost. The absolute humiliation of being dismissed in front of the entire household staff was a sharp physical blow to her high society pride. Her manicured nails dug so deeply into the silk of her ivory robe that the fabric began to stretch and pull. She opened her mouth to argue, her green eyes flashing with an unhinged aristocratic fury, but one look at Julian's cold, immovable expression silenced her. There was no negotiation left in his posture. With a sharp, dramatic turn that caused her silk robe to whip against the air, Victoria marched up the floating glass stairs, the furious click of her slippers echoing loudly against the walls, until she disappeared into the upper master suite, slamming the heavy oak doors behind her. Julian didn't look up. He stood perfectly still in the center of the grand entryway. His eyes closed for a brief moment, as if he were absorbing the heavy, suffocating silence left in her wake. Then he turned his head slowly toward the corner of the room and made a subtle, imperceptible gesture with his hand. Mr. Abernathy, understanding the unspoken cue, instantly nodded respectfully. With quiet, efficient movements, the head butler ushered the junior maids and the rest of the staff out of the grand hallway, closing the double doors to the kitchen wing with a soft final click. The vast multi-million-dollar duplex was suddenly empty. The only sound left was the violent, muffled howling of the New York blizzard battering the floor-to-ceiling glass panels overlooking Central Park. Elena stood rooted to the spot, her body trembling so hard that she had to lean her shoulder against the quartz wall for support. She was still clutching Mia tightly against her chest, her arms wrapped around the little girl like a shield. Mia's small face remained buried in her mother's neck, her tiny fingers still white from gripping the heavy white gold cufflink Julian had given back to her. Elena's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, terrified of what would happen next, waiting for the axe to fall. Julian didn't say a word for what felt like an eternity. He walked over to the quartz console table, his long fingers trailing across the sleek surface before he stopped turning his body fully to face her. The shadows of the winter storm danced across his sharp jawline and the intense, brooding depth of his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the commanding roar of a Wall Street tycoon, nor was it the gentle whisper he had used with Mia. It was low, raspy, and carried a profound, trembling weight that stripped away all the luxury of the penthouse. "Why didn't you tell me, Elena?" The question cut through the cold air of the hallway like a physical blow. Elena's breath caught violently in her throat. A cold dread far more terrifying than the anger of Victoria flooded her veins, freezing her from the inside out. Her face went completely, utterly white, losing every ounce of color. Her eyes snapped up wide and glossy, with a sudden rush of fresh tears meeting Julian's intense gaze for the first time in years. Tell you what, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking so badly it was barely audible over the hum of the heating vents. But the way she said it, the desperate, panicked edge in her tone, the way her knees buckled slightly, and the frantic, reflexive way her arms tightened around Mia, pulling the child even deeper into her embrace, made the truth undeniably clear. She knew exactly what he meant. She had known the moment he stepped down that staircase. Did you feel that the invisible walls that had kept this penthouse running smoothly for 5 years were completely dissolving, revealing a hidden truth that was about to shatter everything you thought you knew about this story? Stay with me, because the secret Elena had been burying in the deepest corners of her soul was about to come completely apart at the seams, and neither of them was prepared for the emotional cost. Julian took a slow, heavy step toward her. He didn't look like a billionaire in that moment. He looked like a man who had suddenly discovered a missing piece of his own soul hidden in plain sight. He kept his hands clasped loosely in front of him, trying his best to appear non-threatening, but the sheer gravity of his presence was overwhelming. 5 years, Elena," Julian murmured, his voice cracking slightly, on the number a rare display of vulnerability from a man who never showed weakness. 5 years, you have slept under this roof, cleaned my floors, and stood in my kitchen. 5 years, I've watched that little girl grow up from a baby in a basket into a 4-year-old, running down my hallways. Elena swallowed hard, a single heavy tear finally breaking free and tracking down her pale cheek. She tried to step back, but her back was already pressed flat against the cold quartz wall. "Mr. Vance, I've always done my work. I've never stolen anything, I swear. Mia didn't mean to go near your things." "This isn't about the cufflink, Elena, and you know it," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping into a fierce, raw whisper as he stopped just 3 feet away from her. He lowered his gaze to the sleeping child in her arms, his expression fracturing into something deeply painful and profoundly tender. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering in the air for a second before he gently, carefully tucked a stray strand of dark hair away from Mia's sleeping face. "I didn't figure it out from a document or a message or a background check," Julian said, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of the little girl's nose, her small forehead, and the distinct curve of her jawline. "I figured it out because of her eyes, because every single day for the past year, I've had to look into those ash-gray eyes." He looked back up, his own gray eyes burning into Elena's with an unbearable intensity. "She has my mother's eyes, Elena," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a sudden suffocating emotion. "The exact same shade of ash gray, the same way they tilt at the corners when she smiles. I've been looking at those eyes in mirrors and old photographs my entire life. I didn't let myself believe it at first. I told myself it was just a cruel coincidence. But watching her stand there today, watching her hold that piece of jewelry..." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his chest rising and falling heavily. "She's mine, Elena. Isn't she?" It wasn't a question. It was a confession. Elena closed her eyes, letting out a ragged, broken sob that she had been holding back for 4 long years. She squeezed Mia close, her head dropping forward as she finally let the wall she had built around her heart crumble into nothingness. "Yes," Elena wept softly, her shoulders shaking violently against the wall. "Yes, Julian, she's yours." The truth hung in the frozen air of the penthouse like a physical entity, heavy and irrevocable. 5 years of silence, 5 years of dust and polished surfaces, 5 years of being a ghost in the house of the only man she had ever truly loved, all of it shattered by a single, desperate admission. Elena leaned her head back against the cold quartz wall, her eyes tightly shut as the tears flowed freely down her cheeks. The heavy weight of the secret she had carried alone for 48 months had finally crushed her defenses. To understand how they had arrived at this fractured moment in a $45 million duplex overlooking a snowy Manhattan, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back 5 years before the Vances, before the glass skyscrapers, before the designer aprons, and before the suffocating etiquette of high society New York. 5 years ago, Julian Vance was 31. He wasn't a multi-billionaire yet. He was close, right on the precipice of greatness, but he was still a man consumed by the brutal, unforgiving machine of street wall. He was working 16-hour days, fueling his ambition with black coffee and cold takeout, eaten alone in a stark, dimly lit corner office. He had everything money could buy at that stage, yet he was hollow, searching for something he couldn't name in a city that never slept. And Elena was 24, a young woman trying to rebuild her life from scratch after her family's small business in Queens had collapsed under the weight of debt. She was working as an anonymous catering server, donning a starched black uniform to pass hors d'oeuvres to wealthy strangers at events she could never afford to attend. They had met at a high-profile charity gala at the Central Park Boathouse. It wasn't cinematic or grand. It happened in a narrow, dimly lit service corridor behind the main ballroom. Julian had slipped away from a crowd of aggressive investors to catch his breath, and Elena was leaning against the wall, resting her aching feet. They had looked at each other, two outsiders in a room full of noise, and they had started talking. Not the superficial, transaction-based small talk of Manhattan elites, but real, raw, honest conversation. They talked for 3 hours about their childhoods, their fears, and what it felt like to be completely lonely in a city of 8 million people. They saw each other 3 more times over the next month. Quiet, hidden meetings in tiny Brooklyn diners where the world couldn't find them. It was a brief, beautiful sanctuary for both of them. And then Julian's first major venture capital fund exploded. Overnight, his life became a hurricane of international flights, high-stakes board meetings, and relentless press coverage. He was pulled into the upper stratosphere of global wealth. At the exact same time, Elena discovered she was pregnant. She had tried to reach him. God knew she had tried. She called his office 3 separate times, her voice trembling as she left messages. But Julian's world had suddenly become guarded by an army of elite corporate gatekeepers. Her calls went directly to a highly ambitious senior assistant, a woman who looked at a catering server's name on a sticky note and immediately categorized it as an extortion attempt or a distraction for her rising star boss. The assistant deleted the messages. Julian never saw them. Elena, broken-hearted and proud, assumed the worst. She told herself that Julian had achieved the billionaire status he always wanted and had chosen to erase his past. She told herself he had discarded her. By the time she realized the truth, that a corrupt assistant had been fired months later for screening personal calls without authorization, Mia was already a year old. By then, Elena had already built a fortress around her daughter and herself. She was survival-driven, exhausted, and terrified of the wealthy world that had seemingly rejected her. When she answered a blind ad through an upscale domestic agency for a live-in housekeeper at a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, she had no idea who owned it. The agency only listed the client as a high-profile executive. Elena would never forget her first day on the job. She had walked into the grand entryway holding a 1-year-old Mia in a carrier, only to see Julian's face staring back at her from a feature article on a desktop monitor. She had frozen. She had wanted to run. But she was down to her last $100, the winter was brutal, and she had a baby to feed. Right then, she made a desperate, terrified, and utterly exhausted decision: she would stay. She would say nothing. She would wear the uniform, she would bow her head, and she would become completely invisible. She convinced herself that Julian was better off not knowing that his high society life had no room for a mistake from his past, and that protecting Mia meant keeping her hidden in the shadows of his success. For 4 years, she had watched him from the edges of rooms. She had cleaned his glasses, ironed his suits, and watched him date high society women like Victoria. And every single day she had carries the burning agony of knowing that the man passing through the kitchen was the father of the little girl playing quietly on the blanket in the corner. "I didn't think you wanted us, Julian." Elena wept now, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the empty hallway. She finally opened her eyes, looking at him through a blur of tears. "I called. I swear I called. When you never answered, I thought you had moved on to your real life. I thought Mia would just be an embarrassment to a man like you." Julian closed his eyes, a deep, ragged breath escaping his chest. His hands shook as he slowly brought them up to cover his face, his shoulders tensing with a wave of pure, unadulterated regret. An embarrassment. Julian's voice was fractured, hollowed out by the realization of the massive, tragic misunderstanding that had stolen 4 years of his daughter's life. He dropped his hands, looking at Elena with raw grief. "Elena, I never got those messages. I swear to you on my mother's memory, I never knew. If I had known, if I had even a hint that you were carrying my child, I would have torn this city apart to find you." He looked down at Mia, who was still fast asleep against Elena's chest, her little light-up bulltoes cold, and still her small hand securely wrapping around the white gold and black diamond cufflink. 4 years. Julian whispered, a single tear spilling from his eye, tracking down the hard line of his face. 4 years. I've lived in this massive, empty cage, fighting for billions of dollars that mean absolutely nothing, while the only real thing I ever created was sitting right here on a folded blanket in my kitchen. The confession didn't wash away the years of pain. It only threw them into a sharper, more devastating light. The realization that 4 entire years had been stolen from him, not by choice, but by a wall of corporate secretaries and deep-seated misunderstandings, tore through Julian Vance like a physical blade. He stood there in his immaculate multi-million-dollar hallway, surrounded by everything a man could ever desire, feeling completely and utterly bankrupt. Elena's shoulders continued to shake as she leaned against the cold quartz wall. The confession she had just made felt less like a relief and more like the opening of a floodgate. All the moments she had spent hiding Mia in the background, all the time she had swallowed her tears, while watching Julian live his separate, untouchable life came crashing down on her at once. "But Julian," Elena whispered, using his first name. For the very first time inside this penthouse, the sound of it strange and heavy on her tongue. "I was so scared. Every single day I woke up terrified that you would look closely at her, realize who she was, and take her away from me. I thought a billionaire with your resources could just snap his fingers and erase a mother like me from the picture." Julian flinched as if he had been struck. The thought that the woman he had once shared his deepest secrets with had spent 4 years viewing him as a threat, as a monster who would steal her child, cut him to the absolute core. "Take her away from you." Julian's voice was barely a raspy whisper. He took another step forward, his large hands reaching out instinctively before he stopped himself, leaving them hovering in the air between them, trembling. "Elena, look at me. Look into my eyes. I am a lot of things. I am ruthless in business. I am cold to my enemies, and I have spent years burying my heart in work. But I would never, ever separate a mother from her child, especially not you, especially not with our little girl." At the sound of the words, our little girl Mia stirred slightly in Elena's arms. The deep, rumbling vibrations of Julian's voice seemed to pull her gently from her terrified sleep. She let out a tiny, soft yawn, her long eyelashes fluttering open. Those large, hauntingly familiar ash-gray eyes blinked once, twice, adjusting to the soft light of the grand hallway. She looked up at her mother's face, seeing the fresh tears shining on Elena's cheeks. Then slowly she turned her head and looked at Julian. There was no scream of anger from Victoria to terrify her now. The hallway was completely quiet, save for the rhythm of the blizzard outside. Mia looked at the tall man standing before them, her small mind trying to process why the intimidating boss who usually passed by without a word was now standing so close with tears in his own eyes. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, with the pure, unblemished intuition that only a child possesses, she extended her tiny hand toward him once more. In her little palm, she was still tightly holding the white gold and black diamond cufflink. "Still pretty," Mia murmured sleepily, her voice incredibly sweet and fragile. "For you." Julian couldn't hold it back anymore. A choked, broken sob escaped his throat, a sound that no one on Streetwall would have ever believed could come from the titan of venture capital. He dropped to his knees for the second time that morning, completely disregarding the pristine floor, and carefully placed his large, warm hand over Mia's tiny fingers, gently closing them over the jewelry. "Keep it, sweetheart." Julian choked out his voice thick with a profound, overwhelming love that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a lifetime. "It belongs to you. Everything in this house belongs to you." Have you ever witnessed a moment where a person's entire universe shifts on its axis in a single second? If you are watching this right now, you are seeing the absolute dismantling of a billionaire's armor. Julian Vance wasn't looking at his portfolio, his investments, or his legacy. He was looking at a tiny girl in cheap light-up boots, realizing that his entire life had just found its true purpose. Elena watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of intense sorrow and a strange, budding sense of hope. For 5 years she had imagined this moment in her nightmares, expecting fury denial or a legal battle. She had never expected this, a man broken open by love kneeling on the floor, begging for a connection with the daughter he never knew he had. But the fragile peace of the hallway was abruptly shattered by the sharp, echoing sound of heavy oak doors opening on the second floor. The click of designer heels against the glass staircase cut through the emotional atmosphere like a siren. Victoria Sterling was coming back down. She had changed out of her ivory silk robe into a stunning, form-fitting camel hair coat, a massive Chanel leather tote bag slung over her shoulder, and her large diamond engagement ring catching the light aggressively. Her face was a mask of cold, calculated arrogance. She had spent the last 15 minutes upstairs, packing a small overnight bag, convinced that her temporary departure would make Julian realize how much he needed her social status and her family's connections. She fully expected him to be waiting at the bottom of the stairs, ready to apologize and hand Elena her termination papers. But as she reached the middle of the floating glass staircase, her green eyes snapped down to the scene below, and her entire body went completely rigid with disbelief. Julian was still on his knees. He was holding the housekeeper's child's hand, his shoulder brushing against Elena's denim apron, his face stained with tears that she had never in their 2 years of dating seen him shed. "Julian!" Victoria's voice wasn't a pout anymore. It was a sharp, piercing screech of absolute outrage that echoed off the high quartz walls. "What on earth is the meaning of this? Why are you still on the floor with these people? The car is going to be here in 30 minutes and you haven't even changed." Julian didn't react immediately. He took a long, deep breath, his large hand gently releasing Mia's fingers. He stood up slowly, turning his body to face the staircase. As he straightened to his full height, the vulnerability vanished from his expression, replaced by a cold, terrifyingly sharp clarity that made Victoria freeze mid-step. "The car isn't going to take us to dinner, Victoria," Julian said, his voice dropping into a register of calm, frozen finality that was far more dangerous than any shout. Victoria gripped the glass railing tightly, a sudden panicked dread washing over her features. "What are you talking about? Julian, don't be ridiculous. We have reservations at Le Bernardin with the city controller. You can't just cancel because your maid had a tantrum." Adequate. Julian walked over to the console table. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his tone completely empty of any human warmth. "The car is going to take you back to your father's apartment on the Upper East Side," Julian said evenly, "and my team will have the rest of your belongings packed and delivered to your doorstep by tomorrow morning." Victoria's hand froze on the glass railing. The color drained from her face so fast that her heavy, high-end makeup looked like a stark, unnatural mask against her skin. She stared down at Julian from the middle of the staircase, her breath hitching in her throat as her brain scrambled to process the words he had just delivered with such casual, terrifying precision. My father's apartment," Victoria stammered, her voice dropping its aristocratic polish and cracking with a mixture of disbelief and escalating panic. She took 2 hurried steps down the stairs, her designer heels clacking frantically against the glass. "Julian, stop this. This isn't funny. You are having some sort of stress-induced breakdown. We are getting married in 4 months. The invitations have been sent to every major real estate family in Manhattan. The deposit on the plaza is non-refundable." Julian didn't look up at her. He reached into his trouser pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a quick, brief message. "The deposit is a rounding error, Victoria, and the invitations can be recalled." "Because of her!" Victoria shrieked, her face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated venom as she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Elena, who was still standing by the quartz wall, holding Mia tightly against her chest. "You are throwing away our future, our family's alliance, and you're standing on street wall for a careless immigrant maid who can't even keep her bastard child out of your dresser. She planned this, Julian. Can't you see that she's been waiting for the perfect moment to trap you, to exploit your guilt, to—" "Victoria, shut up." The words weren't delivered with a shout. Julian didn't raise his voice even a fraction of a decibel, but the sheer absolute weight of the command was so heavy, so dangerously quiet, that the entire grand hallway seemed to drop 5 degrees in an instant. Victoria's mouth snapped shut mid-syllable, her eyes widening in genuine physical fear. She had seen Julian ruthless in business deals. She had seen him dismantle rival hedge funds without a blink, but she had never seen this look in his eyes, a dark, ancient, and protective fury that looked ready to burn her entire world to the ground. Julian stepped closer to the base of the stairs, looking up at the woman he had spent the last 2 years dating. "You will not speak about Elena that way," Julian said, his voice vibrating with a terrifyingly calm finality. "And you will never, as long as you live, refer to that little girl as a bastard again." Victoria swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her Chanel tote bag like a shield. "Julian, she's a servant. She is the mother of my daughter," Julian said. The sentence landed in the room like a detonated explosive. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the New York blizzard slammed a massive wave of white snow against the glass panels, but inside the air had completely turned to glass. Victoria gasped, her eyes darting from Julian's hard, unyielding face down to Mia's large, ash-gray eyes, and then to Elena's tear-stained features. The puzzle pieces suddenly violently crashed together in her mind. The strange, uncharacteristic leniency Julian had shown the child for years, the hauntingly familiar shape of the girl's eyes. It wasn't a maid exploiting a situation. It was a bloodline reclaiming its own. Your daughter," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling as the sheer magnitude of her defeat settled over her. The high society alliance, the multi-million-dollar wedding, her status as the future mistress of the Vance empire, all of it had just evaporated because of a 4-year-old girl in cheap light-up boots. "Mr. Abernathy," Julian called out, his eyes never leaving Victoria. The double doors to the kitchen wing opened instantly, and the head butler stepped into the hallway, his face completely expressionless, but his posture radiating an unshakable alignment with his employer. "Yes, Mr. Vance." "Miss Sterling is leaving," Julian commanded coldly. "Take her bags." "Yes, Mr. Vance." Mr. Abernathy replied, his voice a smooth, unbreakable sheet of velvet. The head butler did not hesitate. He stepped forward with a synchronized mechanical precision, accompanied by 2 large, broad-shouldered estate security guards who had materialized from the private elevator foyer. They stood like stone sentinels at the base of the glass staircase, their dark suits crisp, their eyes completely empty of empathy. Victoria looked at the guards, then at Mr. Abernathy, and finally at Julian. The terrifying reality of her situation was finally sinking through her thick layer of aristocratic denial. She wasn't just being asked to leave, she was being systematically erased from the upper echelons of the Vance empire. "Julian, you can't do this to me," Victoria whispered, her voice losing its venomous edge, replaced by a desperate, hollow pleading. She took the last few steps down the staircase, her expensive camel hair coat swaying her hands, reaching out in a frantic, uncharacteristic gesture of supplication. Think about the press. Think about page 6. What are you going to tell the board of directors? What will my father say to your primary investors? Julian didn't flinch. He stood perfectly straight, his hands tucked casually into his trouser pockets, his gaze so cold it could have frozen the water in the pipes. Your father can withdraw his capital if he chooses, Julian said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It accounts for less than 2% of my current fund. And as for the press, my public relations team will issue a statement before the markets open tomorrow morning citing irreconcilable differences. If a single word about Elena or my daughter leaks to a tabloid, Victoria, I will take it as a personal declaration of war. And you know exactly what happens to people who go to war with me. Inanin akwasama. Victoria stopped 2 feet away from him, her breath hitching. She knew. She had watched him ruthlessly liquidate a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate just 6 months ago because their CEO had insulted his integrity during a private dinner. He was a man who did not bluff. He did not compromise. And right now, he was looking at her as if she were nothing more than a piece of bad data that needed to be permanently deleted from his hard drive. Realizing that tears and pleading would not pierce his armor, Victoria's face underwent a sickening transformation. The desperation vanished, replaced by a twisted, ugly mask of pure aristocratic scorn. She snapped her head toward Elena, her green eyes flashing with an unhinged, venomous hatred. "Enjoy it while it lasts, you pathetic little thief," Victoria hissed, her voice a sharp, piercing blade that echoed off the high court ceiling. "You think because you trapped him with a bastard child you're suddenly one of us? Look at you. You're still just a maid in a denim apron. You will never belong in a place like this. He will realize what you are eventually, and when he does, he will throw you back into the gutter where he found you." "Abernathy!" Julian's voice dropped into a register so dangerously low it made the security guard stiffen. "Remove her, now!" "Right away, sir," Mr. Abernathy said. The 2 security guards stepped forward instantly, their large frames flanking Victoria. They didn't grab her aggressively. They didn't need to, but their physical presence was an absolute unyielding wall. One of them politely but firmly took her heavy Chanel leather tote bag from her shoulder, while the other gestured toward the private elevator doors. "This way, Miss Sterling," the guard said, his voice a flat mechanical drone. "Don't touch me!" Victoria screamed, pulling her arm away violently, though the guards hadn't even brushed against her. She straightened her coat, her chest heaving with a mixture of intense humiliation and rage. She looked at Julian one last time, hoping to see a flicker of regret, a hint of hesitation. There was nothing, just a vast frozen void. With a sharp, dramatic click of her heels, Victoria turned her back on them and marched into the private elevator foyer, her head held high in a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain her dignity. The heavy gold-trimmed elevator doors slid open, swallowed her whole, and closed with a soft, expensive, and completely final thud. The snake had been purged from the garden. The silence that returned to the penthouse was different this time. It wasn't the suffocating, terrifying tension of a few moments ago. It was the clean, empty quiet that follows a violent cleansing storm. Outside, the New York blizzard continued to rage, throwing massive sheets of white snow against the panoramic glass. But inside, the air suddenly felt lighter. It felt like a space where a person could finally breathe. Elena let out a long, shuddering breath that she felt like she had been holding for 5 long years. Her knees buckled completely, this time the sheer emotional exhaustion pulling her down toward the floor. But she didn't fall. Before her knees could touch the quartz marble, Julian's large, powerful hands caught her by the elbows. He moved with a speed that defied his massive frame, his grip firm, warm, and intensely protective. He gently guided her over to the massive, plush, white velvet sofa, the very sofa where Victoria had sat just hours ago, delivering her cruel insults, and helped her sit down. Julian didn't stand over her like a billionaire boss. He immediately dropped back down to his knees, sitting on his heels directly in front of her, his large hands resting on the edge of the cushions, completely focusing his universe on the young mother and the child in her arms. Mia's little light-up boots clicked against the fabric of the sofa as Elena gently set her down on the cushions beside her. The little girl was wide awake now, her large ash-gray eyes moving slowly around the room, sensing that the bad lady was gone and that the energy in the house had completely changed. She looked down at the white, gold, and black diamond cufflink still clutched in her small hand, then looked up at Julian's face. Julian looked at his daughter, his eyes shimmering with a mixture of profound reverence and an agonizing sense of sorrow for the time he had lost. He slowly extended a single long finger, placing it gently into the palm of Mia's tiny hand, right next to the glittering piece of jewelry. Mia didn't pull away. Instead, her small, chubby fingers curled instinctively around his finger, her tiny grip surprisingly strong as she held on to him. A breathtaking, gap-toothed smile slowly spread across her beautiful face, the same radiant, innocent smile that had melted Julian's heart in secret for years. "You're warm," Mia whispered softly, her little voice cutting through the vast room like a ray of pure morning sunlight. "Your hands are warm, mister." A choked, broken laugh escaped Julian's throat, a single tear breaking free and tracking down his sharp cheek. He leaned forward slightly, his forehead gently resting against the side of Mia's small hand. "My name is Julian, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he had never known existed inside his heart. "But if you want, you can call me whatever you want. I'm not going anywhere. I promise you, I am never going anywhere again." Elena watched them, the tears fresh on her face, but for the first time in 48 months, they weren't tears of terror. They were the tears of a mother who had just watched her daughter be claimed by the sky.